مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هناك حول ينطبق على السياسة والشؤون الدبلوماسية والأديان والرياضة، وهو عن بعض الأمور ماتت، وبعض الأمور ماتت ودفنت، وبعض الأمور ماتت ودفنت ثم عادت إلى الحياة. حتى بداية هذا العام مات الأمل بتفادي الديمقراطيين انتخابات كارثية في نوفمبر، وبتفادي خسارتهم البرلمان ومجلس الشيوخ معا. وعندما ارتفع سعر البنزين إلى أكثر من $5 للجالون مات الأمل ودفن. ولكن فجأة وبعد سلسلة من الانتصارات التشريعية واختار ارتكبها الجمهوريون عاد الأمل إلى الحياة، وأصبحت انتخابات منتصف الولايات الآن أقرب أكثر مما توقع الجميع. بحسب التاريخ فالجمهوريون سيفوزون في الانتخابات التشريعية بشكل حاسم، ولكن هل هناك فرصة فعلا للديمقراطيين؟ مع بقاء أقل من شهرين على التصويت الوطني، ما الذي سيحدد النتيجة في مجلس الشيوخ والبرلمان؟ وما الدور الذي سيلعبه الرئيس بايدن؟ لمناقشة الخريطة السياسية والتي أصبحت معقدة أكثر مما كانت عليه قبل 3 أشهر، يسرني أن أستضيف صحفيين سياسيين استثنائيين سارة فارس وأليكس غانجيتانو. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Until recently, Democratic hopes for our November congressional election looked bleak. Republican hopes looked rosy. That's changed in recent weeks. Not 180 degrees, but still substantially. Let's examine why with Alex Gangitano and Sarah Ferris. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Let's start with what's going right for Democrats in a positive sense. There's at least a 3 or 4 categories of things that seem to be breaking in the Democrats' direction. Let's first look at legislation. A few big items that the Democrats can chalk up. Sarah, what were they?
That's right. So there's definitely been a sort of psychological change for Democrats in the last couple of weeks. There was this massive legislative package that Democrats had been working on essentially since President Biden took office. And many Democrats had given up hope. There was just no likelihood of getting this through. They wanted to have these big, ambitious programs for climate, for instance. But it was too divided in the House and Senate. Folks didn't think this was going to get through. And then there was sort of a surprise deal, something that's really unusual in Washington. Everything seems to leak, but this was one that was kept secretive until the last minute. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the ever elusive Senator Joe Manchin actually agreed to key provisions that led to passage of this deal. So there's tax reform in there, there's climate in there. This is something that on its whole is going to take a few years before most people are going to see any kind of impact. But it was, like I mentioned, a psychological impact for Democrats who can start to talk about what they're delivering for voters, even if it's not something that will go into effect before November. This made a big difference in the morale of the party, and party leaders are really excited to be having their members go out and talk about this. President Biden is going out on the trail to talk about this. And there's been a few other less significant pieces of legislation that have been passed as well. There's a big health provision for veterans that it took a long time for both parties to get agreement on, but that did pass. And there's a manufacturing bill that's going to help with some of these semiconductor shortages. And these are just a couple of things that in total is something that is pretty impressive for a party that has such narrow margins in Congress to have gotten done in a midterm year.
So, Alex, there was even a gun control bill that was approved over the course of the summer. How, with a 50-50 divided Senate, did the Biden administration manage to achieve all these legislative successes?
Yeah, that's a good question with the margins so narrow in Congress. It really took the gun control legislation was actually bipartisan. And so that's something that President Biden loves to talk about, is that he got some Republicans to also vote for this and to strike a deal on this really historic bill. It's been decades since Congress has acted on gun violence prevention. In terms of the big climate and health bill and tax bill that Sarah was referring to, that was all passed because Democrats got together and got the votes in order to do it along party lines. And so that's another thing that the president and members and candidates are going to bring to the campaign trail, is we were able to pass this historic climate bill and every Republican voted against it, and no Republicans were on our side. And so that's something that I think they're really going to use on the campaign trail to say, Democrats are delivering here and Republicans, are the party of no, or the party of not wanting to act on any of this. And so those are kind of the themes that they'll be bringing when they go out.
When we come back after the break, we're going to turn to the other huge political event in the last several weeks, the search of Mar-a-Lago, and what that may mean for ex-President Trump and Republican hopes come November. In just a moment. Of all America's wars, Desert Storm, the war to liberate Kuwait, which began with Iraq's invasion 30 years ago this month, has been memorialized in film less than just about any other war in our history. But there are still a handful of memorable movies that deserve a second look sometime between now and next March, when the final battles of Desert Storm were fought 3 decades ago. I recommend these 3. In the 1996 film Courage Under Fire, Denzel Washington plays a Gulf War veteran tasked with investigating the worthiness of Captain Karen Walden, played by Meg Ryan, to receive a Medal of Honor after her apparent heroic actions during Desert Storm. Does she deserve the medal? The fog of war has a leading role in this thought-provoking film. Secondly, in the 1999 film Three Kings, featuring an A-list cast of George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg, and Ice Cube, a small group of American soldiers decides to search for hidden treasure near their desert base at the end of the fighting. Their journey leads to unexpected discoveries, but a crisis of conscience forces them to risk everything for what they believe. And thirdly, with Jake Gyllenhaal in the leading role, the 2005 film Jarhead depicts the journey of a Marine sniper from his deployment in Saudi Arabia to his unit's participation in Operation Desert Storm. This film has been praised for effectively bringing the game of nations down to the individual war each soldier fights, both inside himself as well as against the enemy. Each of these films is worth a couple of hours. Take the time and watch them. Again, my guests today include Alex Gangitano. Alex is White House reporter at The Hill, where she was previously the Heard on the Hill and lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, she was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call. Also joining us is Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that's all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she's also reported for The Hill and The Washington Post. All right, Alex, let me ask you about Mar-a-Lago. What happened and what is the political significance of what happened for Donald Trump and the Republican Party?
Yeah, there's a lot of political significance now, and we're still kind of in this period of waiting and seeing how this plays with the Trump base, with moderate Republicans, and if this becomes an issue that people vote on in the midterms. So basically, federal agents searched the former president's Florida home, the Mar-a-Lago estate, and were in part of this investigation looking for these documents that the former president, had removed from the White House and was holding at this estate. And he had taken things that were top secret or classified. And so that's really the big issue here, is that he took these documents that, usually you can't even take out of a room that inside of the White House, let alone remove them from the premises. And then what these documents actually say has been a huge point of debate, because, a lot of Trump supporters and Trump's lawyers and Trump himself are saying, well, reveal what you found and let the American people know what this investigation was really about, and kind of trying to cover his tracks to say that he didn't do anything wrong by removing these documents. But, we heard from the Justice Department that a lot of these were top secret. A lot of these were classified. And really, that comes down to a national security issue of how much they can really reveal to people what was in these documents. And so that's the big question. And, the former president has come out with a lot of defenses here, saying, these were actually declassified, or he was able to take them because of executive privilege. And, he's been trying to really defend himself of why all these boxes were at his Florida home.
And so, Sarah, the more the headlines focus on Donald Trump, is this good news for Republicans on the ballot in November, or is this problematic news for Republicans?
Well, it depends. It depends on the district that you're talking about. It depends on the state that you're talking about. And Republicans have so many seats at play that on the whole, enthusiasm in the Republican Party, where they want to defend their former president, they want to accuse Democrats of having a politically motivated investigation. This potentially could help bring Republicans out. Republicans really see what President Biden's Justice Department has been doing as politically motivated, as something that is an abuse of power in their minds. And so there's plenty of Republicans who are charged up and they're angry, and anger is a very key motivation for bringing folks out in a midterm. And then there's of course many candidates running in more swing districts, these real battleground districts, where it's more evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans in those districts. And what the candidates are doing there is simply trying not to answer questions about President Trump. They don't want to talk about whether he should run in 2024, about whether he should be under the scrutiny of the Justice Department. They're just going to try to ignore the issue. So Republicans are going to try to have it both ways here, where if it can benefit their base to talk about what they see as injustices against President Trump, former President Trump, then they're going to do that. They're going to be talking it up. They're going to be having these kinds of rallies. They'll probably even be inviting Trump into their districts, looking for his endorsement. And in the races where it is going to matter a lot less to the voters there, then you're just going to see those candidates taking a different strategy. And that's something Republicans have successfully done before. And again, there's so many seats at play. The map this year is really, really big for Republicans that this might be something that they can pull off.
So one of the other factors which may be causing some Republican strategists a bit of indigestion is that in some key races, some of the most sort of extreme candidates won statewide seats. So take Pennsylvania or Arizona. Their Republican gubernatorial candidates, or even Maryland, are on the extreme end of the Republican spectrum, rather than the more moderate who might win some of the centrist votes that are up for grabs. When you look at candidates in, say, Arizona and Pennsylvania, they give a lot of Republican strategists some pause. Democrats seem to have hopes that they can take these states. Alex, is that a realistic aspiration?
That's right. I think a lot of Republicans are having pause from this situation, that these extreme Republicans, a lot of times these are President Trump has endorsed these people, did win their primaries. And so then in the general election, you're seeing a extreme Trump-backed Republican versus a Democrat. And I think that will really show President Trump how much his stronghold is still on the Republican Party, is how these candidates do. Would a more moderate Republican or an independent prefer a Democrat over a more extreme Republican? In the case of Maryland, the Republican on the ballot is Trump endorsed and beat a more moderate Republican on the ballot for the governor's race in November. And actually, the current sitting Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, who's fairly moderate himself, has come out and said he won't support this Republican candidate and distanced himself from him and has criticized him. And that really shows that the more institutional Republicans don't want really anything to do with these kind of extreme people who they're seeing win their primaries in certain states. What that means for Democrats, we'll see.
So when you add it all up, Sarah, 6 months ago, it looked like a Republican sweep, House and Senate. When you add it all up, how does it look today?
Well, I think there's a lot of the biggest question in November will certainly be turnout. And Democrats are trying to use the issues that they have seen go their way in the last couple of months. Like we talked about, some pretty big pieces of legislation, this huge abortion ruling against their party. They're trying to use this for to drive folks out with anger. But we're also seeing that with fear as well. As Alex was just talking about, Democrats are working really hard to paint Republicans as extremists. They're tying them to election deniers, tying them to the insurrectionists at the Capitol 2 years ago. So Democrats are really trying to use these emotions of fear and anger to drive out their voters. But on the other side, Republicans, as I mentioned, have an enormous map this year. There's many reasons for that, including the fact that this is a once in a decade redistricting process, which means all the maps in the United States congressional districts are redrawn based on population, and Republicans really came out with the advantage in that process. So there's sort of a wonky element to all this, another reason why Republicans are favored. But you can't ignore the fact that President Biden's approval ratings are low. And this is a really significant kind of wind at the back for Republicans, that all they have to do is show up and convince their voters that this is a referendum on President Biden. And if that can happen, then I think we're going to see them pick up a lot of seats. But again, Democrats have these additional factors that they didn't necessarily have a couple months ago, the kinds of anger and fear that they're really hoping can bring their voters out in what is typically a very low turnout election. But both sides are scrambling really hard right now to make sure that that's not what happens. And it's starting to feel more like a presidential year if you watch television in the swing district right now.
And Alex, is there any one wild card that our viewers should be watching for that might change this dynamic?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think what really I'm focused on is the fact that right now there is a good amount of momentum. Right now, the president was actually able to break his 40 and below approval rating, and he's around 44, which is still low, but he's breaking it. And so I think that the big factor will be what happens in September, especially legislatively in Congress. Can Democrats just focus on these legislative victories they've had? Can they just try to move forward and hope that the next 3 months they can continue on this momentum? Or will they not have much success in September passing things like more aid for Ukraine or more COVID funding and things like that? And then they are back to maybe where they were a few months ago. And so it's really looking at, can they build on this? Can they move forward with this momentum? Or will it kind of fizzle out going into the fall?
All right, terrific. Thank you both, Alex and Sarah, for helping explain this shift in the political winds here in Washington. Thank you for being on Dakhel, Washington. Politics in America is becoming like Mark Twain's description of the weather in New England. If you don't like it, he said, wait a few minutes, joking about how rapidly it changes. So too with the fortunes of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden entered the White House with a 50-50 tie in the Senate and a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives. Since then, his personal popularity has plummeted. As the pandemic went through new phases, he failed to get passage of the Build Back Better plan, and inflation, especially food and gas prices, rose higher than an Elon Musk rocket. Nothing seemed to be going right. Historically, the party in power loses midterm elections, and the conventional wisdom was that the Republicans would trounce the Democrats in the coming vote, probably sweeping to victory in both the House and the Senate. And then the rain stopped, the sun came out, and the Democrats' prospects stopped looking so gloomy. Lots of factors seem to have come together at the same time. Suddenly, Biden scored some legislative wins on major bills to fight climate change, support the domestic technology industry, and even to tighten gun control laws. At the same time, the Supreme Court took decisions, abolishing the federal right to an abortion and loosening gun control laws that angered large numbers of Americans who saw the court's moves as too extreme. This had the effect of firing up the Democratic voter base. And then came the FBI search of Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate, which turned up hundreds of classified and top secret documents, putting the former president back in the news. Along the way, there were primary elections whose results were that moderates generally won among Democrats, and avid Trump supporters, some of whom don't even recognize Joe Biden as president, generally won among Republicans, underscoring the former president's still tight control over the party. And by the way, the price of gasoline has now dropped to less than $4 a gallon. Add it all up, and among Democrats, optimism is back. There's a real hope, not just for praying for a Hail Mary miracle, that Democrats may prevent a Republican sweep in November and may even hold on to control of perhaps even both houses of Congress. Of course, there's a long way to go until November. If Democratic fortunes could change so dramatically over the past couple of months, they can change again over the next couple of months. So too with inflation, unemployment, and the prices of milk, meat, and a gallon of gas. Wild cards are everywhere. Key Senate races in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina will be determined more by the character of the local candidates than anything else, though Donald Trump could certainly insert himself in various ways in all these races. It will be a wild ride, the outcome of which will have a huge impact, both on the last 2 years of Joe Biden's term and the two big decisions our nation is waiting for. Will Donald Trump and will Joe Biden run for president again? Isn't democracy terrific? Stay tuned. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن السياسة المتبادلة في انتخابات الكونغرس العامة في نوفمبر، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك الحين شكراً وإلى اللقاء.